Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site. Also, bettingangle.us. Today is September 21st, 2025. Let's talk about boxing royalty. Right? A fighter many consider to be the best ever. Right? He's certainly on the short list. Ali one time famously said, "I'm the greatest ever at heavyweight." But the best ever is Sugar Ray Robinson. Let's talk about him, but first remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, we're just going to key on some specific Ray Robinson fights. But I need for people to understand who the man was. Right? It's very important. Forget his pro record. I need for you to understand that Robinson, as an amateur in New York City, a hotbed for boxing. In other words, there are a lot of promising boxers in New York City. Right? Robinson as an amateur was 85-0 with 69 KOs. Right? Again, this is not his professional record. We're talking about the period before he became a professional. According to reports, 40 of his amateur fights ended by first round knockout. Now, Robinson, as a pro, at the time he fights Joey Maxim, had 91 wins, 2 losses, Jake LaMotta, and Boxing Hall of Famer Randy Turpin. We're going to talk about the Turpin fights. He also had 1 draw, right? 59 KOs to go with the 91 wins. Let's talk about that Joey Maxim fight. Understand, Joey Maxim, Hall of Famer, was the reigning light heavyweight champion at the time. Robinson was leaving the sport, as Robinson openly admitted to members of the press who asked him. He was not in love with boxing. Boxing was a business for him. He was a boxer because he did it well, not because he loved the sport. Now, at the time that he stopped by Joey Maxim, right, Robinson can't come out for the 14th round, 15-round fight. Understand that Robinson, the then reigning middleweight champion, was ahead on the scorecards as follows. One judge had him up 10 rounds to 3 for Maxim. Right? 15-round fight, there were 2 rounds left. The second judge had him up 9 rounds to 3, with 1 being a draw. Right? 9-3-1 card. The last judge had Robinson up 7 rounds to 3, with 3 rounds being a draw. In other words, and Robinson can't continue. If you look at the film, he spent. Right? The interesting part of the fight is that Ruby Goldstein, the referee, suffers heat exhaustion before Robinson does. Right? Robinson, one of the better interviews in boxing history. Right? This is the guy who, when they came up to him and asked him about why he couldn't continue, he said, well, the referee couldn't continue and no one was hitting him. Right? Well, let me just say, it's Robinson at the moment of the Joey Maxim fight that people equate with the best in history. Right? When he comes back after his song and dance career fails, he's not the same fighter. Several fighters gave him problems in the later 50s, right? Several. But at this moment, the Ray Robinson who only lost to the Raging Bull, right, and who lost to Randy Turpin, is widely viewed as the best. Now let me make a point here. It's going to be mixed, right? Robinson, great fighter. He's a guy with demons. If you think Jack Johnson had demons, you have no idea about how Johnson didn't quite face the challenges that Ray Robinson faced. Right? Understand, Robinson in the Army in World War II, and many people feel that the reason he's able to continue his boxing career after World War II was because of the alpha in the room, heavyweight champion Joe Louis, right, who was a good friend, who helped him. But I just want people, and I'm not going to take up most of this video here with this, but I want people to Google Ray Robinson, military deserter. Right, again, Ray Robinson, military deserter. An argument can be made that Robinson deserted the military. Right? Understand, this is in the 40s. Right? This is before Jackie Robinson. Here's a black man who had a cush assignment compared to other soldiers in the military, being part of a boxing unit with Joe Louis. Right? Just understand that Robinson, has an elaborate story where he claims that he suffered amnesia and that he wasn't technically AWOL. Now, I need for people to understand that at that point in Robinson's boxing career, people understood, given his unbeaten amateur record coming up, given that he starts his career 40-0, 40 wins, no losses, before he fights a much heavier Jake LaMotta. Right? Given that, as great an actor as Robert De Niro is in The Raging Bull, just understand, De Niro doesn't do Jake LaMotta justice. If you sit down and you look at LaMotta films, including him against Marcelo Cerdan and other fights, you realize that the Raging Bull actually had a back foot. He's a multi-dimensional fighter. And understand, Ray Robinson, by the time he runs into problems in the Army, Ray had already been in the ring with the Raging Bull. Right? Ray had already established himself in the fight game. Now, what I want people to realize is that Robinson was an avoided fighter, to the point where he doesn't win the welterweight title until 1946. He's already fighting Jake LaMotta. Right? Eventually, they have to give him a shot at the title. Right? This is a guy who had been fighting since the 30s. He does not win the welterweight title until 1946. Let's talk about his personal life. Now, you have some brothers who rubbed society the wrong way. Right? You have Jack Johnson. This is from the early part of the century, right? Johnson's big fight, the Jim Jeffries fight, is July the 4th, 1910. Right, by then, Johnson's already the reigning heavyweight champion. Right, you can imagine Johnson in 1907, 1908, 1909. He's the athlete America hates. Right, he's running around with white women. Johnson is speeding. They stop him. They tell him that, the fine is something like $10 or something like that. And according to the story, Johnson takes out a 20. Right? I'm making up the numbers, but Johnson takes out twice the fine. And when the cop asks this black guy who's traveling alone why he's paying him twice the fine, Johnson responds, "Well, I'm going to be speeding on the way back." Right, now that's Johnson. Johnson's my favorite athlete in history. Right, Johnson's unapologetic. Johnson is dangerous. Right, just understand that's not Ray Robinson. Right, first off, Ray's real name is Walker Smith Jr. Right, folks, he wasn't even using Ray Robinson as a stage name. Rather, he knew a guy named Ray Robinson. He wanted to fight in some athletic competition, but wasn't age appropriate because Walker Smith had been fighting from the time he was 14, 15 years old. So he borrowed his friend's name. And once he registered and started having success, he wasn't able to go back to his name. Right? Robinson is viewed as Mr. America. I went to school with someone whose parents talked about how Ray Robinson was a favorite and how he was, the societally accepted black guy at the time. These were some white people. Right? Robinson, had his hair, had a certain flair. People loved him. Robinson wrote an autobiography where the mob came to him. Right? And the mob was, hinting that if he did certain things, they would hook him up in other ways. And Robinson, who had a well-known manager who protected him, a guy named George Gainford, politely refused. And the mob let him refuse. Right? Keep in mind, we know he paid a price because he does not win the welterweight title until 1946. But Robinson was so good, the mob leaves him alone. But I need for people to understand that his life's more complicated. Right? His wife, as she got older, started giving interviews. And she flatly says that she was a victim of domestic violence. Right? Understand, we know now, just like we know that Archie Moore, a guy who, when I grew up, my dad was a heavy boxing fan. He loved Archie Moore, right? Archie's before my time. But Archie was an old man when I was a kid. And I viewed Archie Moore as a role model. Come to find out that Archie Moore had multiple wives. Right? Google it. Right? We're now in an era where when I make a factual assertion, you can Google it. Well, I need for people to understand that, Ray Robinson, as you could imagine, was a man about town. Right? This is the guy who had the fancy car. This is the guy who was dating several women. In other words, Ray Robinson was not what he seemed. He's still one of my favorite fighters ever. But people need to be careful. Right? You look at someone like Terence Crawford. Crawford strikes me as, a guy who loves boxing. He lives boxing. Right? Crawford, you see Crawford, you can tell he loves being a dad. Right? I saw a Crawford interview where Crawford was talking about, being a role model for his kids and how he tells his kids to think for themselves. And you could tell That's something he was into, right? You need to realize that you need to be careful in meeting your idols, right? Robinson's a different character. Robinson has that mid-50s image down, right? You know, the pressed clothes, you know, the friendly public persona, right? In actuality, Robinson was, you know, a playboy. Robinson was all around town, right? Robinson viewed boxing as a means to an end. He would tell people he didn't love boxing, right? Robinson had a fight with Jimmy Doyle. He kills Jimmy in the ring, right? Robinson hit that hard. We'll talk about his fight style here. He kills Jimmy Doyle in the ring. And when they came to him, and this is Robinson's personality, right? Robinson basically, you know, they asked him, when did you know you had him in trouble? Right? They actually did an investigation into what happened. And Robinson just politely said, according to reports, you know, this is the hurt business. It's my job to get him in trouble. Right? That's who Robinson was. You look at his fight style, it's different from Mayweather, from Crawford, who was a closer. Right? Understand, Crawford's had some early knockouts. But Crawford is a guy who, you know, lets the game come to him. Right? Crawford is dissecting you. Crawford is guarded early in fights. This isn't the free swinger. Right now, understand, Ray Robinson is a different personality type. This is the guy with an explosive left hook. Right? This is the guy who, you know, comes out, he might be dancing a little bit. He's very high risk. Right? This is a guy who bends over and is hitting you in the body with jabs. This is a guy who, if he's at a certain angle on you inside, doesn't guard himself. Right? If he has his head off by your head, he figures, my head's hidden enough. This guy can't hit me. Right? You look at the Jake LaMotta last fight, right? That's the fight we have tape on. And, you know, he's just opening up on Raging Bull, who was dangerous. Right? Robinson is really a puncher-boxer more than a boxer-puncher. This is the guy who, you know, would take you out early if he could. So let me say this, and Robinson's obviously too complicated a subject matter to, you know, put in one YouTube video. Let me just say he was friends with people like Frank Sinatra. He had a club in Harlem. He would invite Sinatra over, Joe DiMaggio, and stuff like that. He was a man about town. He had the gorgeous wife, but she's really a trophy wife. Right? In many ways, he is like O.J. Simpson. Right? O.J., you know, is with Nicole, but he's roaming around. Right? You know, O.J.'s a bit self-involved. Right? Great back. One of the best backs I've ever seen. Right? 4.7 yards per carry, folks. That's more than, you know, Emmitt Smith and Walter Payton. And this was in an era where you knew Buffalo was going to hand the ball off to O.J. Right? This is different than Barry Sanders, right? 5.0 yards per carry, where, you know, Barry's operating in a run and shoot offense. This is more Jim Brown, where everyone in the stadium knows he's going to get the ball and you could not stop O.J. Simpson. Right? But O.J. really was, man about town. Had other women on the side. Right? Was a narcissist. That is Ray Robinson. So, Gordon Parks, one of my favorite people. The guy who makes the movie Shaft. Right? A life photographer. He's in Europe with Ray Robinson. Ray Robinson is doing a series of fights. At the time, he's only lost once, and that's to Jake LaMotta, and of course, that's the only time Jake LaMotta beat him. Right? LaMotta, of course, would go on to be a world champion. Well, just understand, he's in Europe, and if you believe Gordon Parks, Robinson barely trains. Right? Robinson is the opposite of Floyd Mayweather. Right? He's the opposite of these fighters who are living in the gym. I view Robinson as just a guy who was gifted, who thought things out. He's a different personality than Jack Johnson. Understand, Jack Johnson lost to a guy. This is when boxing was semi-legal. Then they're both in a jail cell together. And Robinson openly admits that he starts talking to the guy, and the guy changed his life. Johnson says to him, "What was I doing wrong in the ring?" And the guy told Johnson. And Johnson was a guy who studied defense and stuff like that. Right, folks? I'm just telling you, that's not Ray Robinson. Right? Figure out the guys. Robinson is bringing movement. He's up on his toes. He's bringing a lot to the sport. Right? But understand, like Carlos Monzon, one of the best middleweights in history, this was a guy who loved to be out late at night. Right? This was the guy who, had full-blown mistresses. Right? This is not the guy who is, working out late at night, watching his diet. This is the opposite of Marvin Hagler. This is the opposite of Bernard Hopkins. Right? This is the guy who is simply in boxing because he's good at it. So, if you believe Gordon Parks, Robinson isn't preparing at all for Randy Turpin. Now that's a name you need to know. Boxing Hall of Famer, one of the more sensational deaths in boxing history. Right? There's an open question on whether he committed suicide. Right? Understand, you need to read up on Turpin. I believe life's unfair. I believe Randy Turpin, if he fought Ray Robinson, would give Ray Robinson a tough fight all the way through. Right? Understand, in my favorites folder right now is a must-watch. It, in my opinion, is one of the most important films in boxing history. By the time Robinson fights Joey Maxim, he has 2 losses. We always hear about the Jake LaMotta loss. Always. We never hear about the loss to Randy Turpin. And I'm just here to tell you, if you look at the film yourself, you're going to realize that that fight is not close. Right? Turpin, who history seems to have forgotten, has a center of gravity. Right? This is my take looking at film. Other people think differently. He has a high center of gravity. So while Robinson comes in and Robinson's a little bit crouched over, and Robinson wants some kind of, exchange, some kind of action, and while Robinson is very heavy-handed, right? Just understand that Turpin is that rare fighter who is at least as heavy-handed as Robinson is. I would argue Turpin's even heavier-handed than Robinson. Right, folks? Turpin is heavier-handed than light heavyweight champion Joey Maxim. You look at their backs, Turpin has one of the broadest backs I've ever seen. And let me say this, too. Turpin's high risk. Turpin's inconsistent. In other words, he's not committed to it. But Turpin has genius level defense, right? The boxer who comes to mind in terms of Turpin's defense, where Turpin is in front of you and he folds his hands and he's seeing you throw shots and he's just trying to roll with the shots while not backing up. Right? The person whose defense reminds me of Turpin's is Shakur Stevenson. Now understand, Stevenson, southpaw, different than Turpin. Right? Stevenson, is more of a boxer. Turpin is a very heavy puncher who's just waiting for his turn to throw shots. But I need for people to see the dynamic in the Robinson-Turpin fight, right? And Turpin had mental health issues. If you know someone who has mental health issues, right? And if you get into their thought process, you'll realize they think differently than everyone else. Maybe later in life, they'll have a mental health breakdown. But the person, in the moment, can actually have an advantage because they don't sense the fear the rest of us would sense. So what I want people to do, because it's a big moment in boxing, in my opinion, you don't understand Ray Robinson unless you see the Turpin fights, plural. Right? Robinson never, until the 10th round of the rematch, Robinson never figures out a way to dominate Randy Turpin. What I want people to do is they look at the film in my favorites. Right? The first fight, Robinson against Randy Turpin. As you watch the film, ask yourself a foundational question. Can Robinson, who moves well, who's a big puncher, who didn't have to knock you out, although he did a lot of the time, he could outpoint you. Could Robinson move Turpin backward? Right? This is a guy with 40 first-round knockouts as an amateur. This is a guy who, by the time he gets to Joey Maxim, and he has 91 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw, he has 59 KOs. More than half of his fights are by stoppage. Right? This is a guy who, there are films where he hits Rocky Graziano so hard Graziano's mouthpiece flies out before Graziano hits the canvas. Right? The Robinson highlights, and I have another film, right? It's called Board Films, right? On Ray Robinson. Understand, a lot of Ray Robinson's fights were not taped. Right? But realize the fights that are taped are stunning. Right? Where guys are getting hit, and you see the guy, and the guy's out on his feet before he hits the canvas. They have a fight on that board footage where he beats up a guy so bad that between rounds, his corner, these were the old days, jumps in the ring, picks up the guy, carries him back to the corner to try to revive him so he could come out for the next round against Ray Robinson. Right, folks? I believe when Ray Robinson steps in the ring with Randy Turpin, who he barely knew, he found a fighter who was completely unafraid. Right? Because Randy Turpin, in his fights, was almost always the biggest puncher. Right? Randy Turpin comes at Ray Robinson, is unafraid. Ray cannot back him up. He just can't. And understand, Turpin is not Joe Frazier. This isn't the guy who's moving, bobbing, and weaving and getting inside on you. No, Turpin is almost moving in slow motion. I'm sure Robinson figured out by the end of the second round that Turpin was one of the hardest punchers he ever faced. So there is Robinson trying to tilt Turpin onto his back foot. There is Robinson trying to walk Turpin into jabs. Robinson can't crack Turpin's mental makeup. Right? Turpin stands there, lets Robinson throw at times. Right? Has his hands like this. Bends his knees. But is high all the time compared to Robinson, who's bending at the waist. Then Turpin would, when Robinson stopped throwing punches, Turpin would counter him. Folks, I need to have people look at the film in my favorites folder, right? These are all recent additions, where Marv Albert, the Nick announcer at the time, and Ferdy Pacheco, Ali's doctor, they used to do a lot of boxing on NBC. And they have what they call the sixth best round in history. I believe it's round 10 of the rematch, 90 days after Ray Robinson lost to Randy Turpin. Now, it's a tribute to Ray Robinson that somehow within 90 days they were able to set up a fight in New York City and get more than 60,000 fans there. Right? That's how popular Ray Robinson is. But what I need for people to understand is that knockouts cause amnesia. Ray Robinson is in the fight of his life, in the rematch. Right? You know, let's just say the fight's competitive. It's not like Robinson had an off night and then in the rematch destroys Randy Turpin. No, that fight hangs in the balance. Listen to what Marv Albert and Ferdy Pacheco have to say on the telecast. Right, look at the guys at the start of the round. Now, it's one of those moments that changes the trajectory of the sport. Right, just like Bud's victory over Canelo has changed the trajectory of the sport. How we remember this era, you know, how we remember Canelo fairly or unfairly. Right? I need for folks to understand that the Robinson-Turpin rematch featured two big punchers. And it's only because Ray Robinson lands a home run shot that drops Randy Turpin that we look back on the sport as we do. Right? Turpin then gets off the canvas, is diminished. Right? Such was the power of Ray Robinson. Right? So then Ray maneuvers him over to the ropes. You see that Turpin isn't Shakur Stevenson defensively when he's over by the ropes. In fact, Turpin's defense is really a convenience. right? So Turpin is bending at the waist. He's trying to dodge shots. Robinson, who understands one fight and almost 10 rounds into the rematch that this is his big moment, lets his hands go. And the referee, Rudy Goldstein, the same ref who later referees the Joey Maxim fight and is overcome by heat exhaustion, jumps in to stop the fight. Right, folks? Up until the start of that 10th round, and the fight was scheduled for 15, right? Just understand, Ray Robinson was clueless on how to deal with Randy Turpin. Right? Turpin is a big-time figure. I even have the Mitri fight, where Turpin gets knocked out in the first round by a left hook. Right? Now, given that Robinson has one of the best left hooks in history, you wonder why Robinson, in 15 rounds plus 9 full rounds of the rematch, couldn't deck Turpin with his left hook like Mitri, who got lucky. Was able to deck Turpin 2 years after the rematch against Ray Robinson, right? Understand, by then, Turpin was having a problem making weight. Also, if you know people with mental health challenges, right, sometimes they start to deteriorate. Right? Google Randy Turpin's death. We're not going to get into it here. It's salacious. Right? But Google Randy Turpin's death. Understand, Turpin does not make it to 40. Just understand, Robinson had a rematch clause, immediately decided that he was going to try to enforce the rematch. It wasn't that long after he had lost his middleweight title to Randy Turpin and then won it back that Robinson then decided he'd had enough of boxing. Right? You know, that's when he decides to fight Joey Maxim. Just understand, Turpin was so good that Turpin is a Hall of Famer. If someone were to ask me, what were Robinson's toughest fights? Clearly the Jake LaMotta fight, where Robinson's almost knocked out of the ring, and the Randy Turpin fight are the toughest fights prime Robinson had. Right? Later, Robinson fights Gene Fullmer. I'm sure everyone in the building has heard about the anchor punch fight. Just understand that's not the only time they fought. Right? Robinson, you know, when he comes back to the sport, it's like Jordan returning to basketball. Excellent fighter, but not quite who he was. Understand, too, Robinson leaves the sport to go into show business. He thought he was a singer and dancer. Right? I would say, you know, of all the fighters I've seen, the fighter who comes the closest to Robinson is Ray Leonard. And let me just say, Ray Leonard had a sense of humor. Right? Ray was a guy who was, you know, trained by Dundee. No doubt heard a lot of Ali stories. And Ray saw himself as, you know, a showman, a bit of a clown type figure, right? Ray would stare at you and overdo it so everyone knew that he wasn't too serious about it and stuff like that. Robinson didn't have that sense of humor. Right? But both guys had flair. Both guys were heavy punchers. Right? Understand, Ray Leonard, very heavy puncher. Right? Like Ray Robinson. Right? Robinson was really in there to blow you out and then move on. Ray Leonard added a little bit extra spice where he's shaking his glove and stuff like that, right? Look at the end of the Thomas Hearns fight, where Ray hits him. Ray starts celebrating before he even gets to Thomas Hearns. Then he's shaking his glove, so you're in the crowd and you're getting that extra, excitement and stuff like that. While Robinson's flashy compared to the fighters of his era, you get the feeling that he's flashy just to set up a knockout. Whereas Ray Leonard's flashy just to be flashy. Just to kind of show you, look, I'm an artist. This is the artwork I'm laying down in this fight. I believe by contrast, Ray Robinson just wanted the fight to be over. Right? So Robinson's interesting. I mean, he is one of my favorites, right? I like these athletes who, ask for top dollar, have their own style, aren't trying to always please the public, right? Listening to some of these Robinson interviews, it's jarring. On the film board, Robinson doesn't even try to hide the fact that his name's not even Ray Robinson, that it's Walker Smith, right? He's not even hiding this, that story. Let me also say, too, that Robinson, little bit provocative, right? One would have thought that Robinson, who is an older guy by the time the 60s come around, right? One would have thought that Robinson would completely align himself with the civil rights movement and stuff like that. Right? Understand Malcolm X is big in Harlem at a time when Ray Robinson's big in Harlem. Right? But that wasn't really the case. The guy is more complicated than that. Right? Don't just go for the Sugar Ray Robinson, tagline. And understand, too, even the Sugar Ray, the press gave him that name. Right? This is the guy, and it gives him an authenticity. Right? This isn't the marketing guy who comes up with the, great name. No, this is New York media. Seeing a guy who is a little bit awkward around the edges, quite frankly. Right? A guy who's a bit awkward, but who, of course, wore the best robes into the ring. Right? Was current, had his hair conked, and, the look dated by the 60s. But you see Ray Robinson in the 50s, and my God, he's current. Right? This is a guy Nat King Cole would call stylish. Right? And, of course, Ray had the clothes, and Ray was unapologetic. People like Carmine Basilio hated him because Ray wanted all the money. Fighters wanted to fight him, but Ray, who did not love boxing, wouldn't accept the fight unless he was paid an arm and a leg. Right? Watch some of the videos that I have in my favorites folder. Folks, the man is more complicated than people think. Right? The image was blinding, right? The pink Cadillac and all that other stuff in the 50s. The image is blinding. He had friends in boxing, right? But just understand, he, to me, in some ways, is more complicated than Jack Johnson, right? Johnson, you understood, was a libertine. Johnson, you understood, didn't buy the hype, right? Had no problem with people condemning him. Had a complicated relationship with the NAACP, but you understood that, Johnson supported, equal rights for all and stuff like that. Ray Robinson's a little bit more interesting, right? I'll just put it that way. He's a bit more interesting. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Please remember Randy Turpin. The sport has some Hall of Famers. who have some big wins, does it get bigger than beating Ray Robinson? Right? Has some guys who have some big wins, some guys who are absolutely fearless. Look at Turpin against Ray Robinson, folks. He's not there asking for an autograph. He's not intimidated in the slightest. Right? And it's just sad that, as time goes by, we all remember Ray Robinson. Many of us have no idea how tough that rematch was for Ray Robinson. Right? That Ray was lucky to escape with a 1-1 record against Randy Turpin. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.